How good is WRC 10? Hey there folks, watch this video, and here I'm going to be giving my first impressions based off of around 10 hours of gameplay in WRC 10, the newest offering from Nacon and Kyloton. And let's start off by just prefacing it with my own experiences in the past. I've got 20 plus years of rallying games experience, pretty much my whole lifetime really, and it includes some of the more hardcore simulator stuff, like talking Dirt Rally, Richard Burns Rally, some of the more arcade stuff, like all of the WRC games going back to the earliest ones around the year 2000. And in addition to that, other kind of arcadey titles, so you can talk about things like V-Rally and so on and so forth. But in addition to that, I will be referring to my computer specs at some point. I've been playing this on computer in terms of the hardware that I use. So for playing the game, I have a Logitech G29 and my pedals are Thrustmaster TLCMs. In terms of what's inside of my computer, I have an Intel i7-9700K CPU, an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1660 Super for my graphics card, and in terms of RAM, if we're going to be talking that, Corsair Vengeance LPX 32GB. But let's get into talking about, well, the game itself, because there are a lot of other reviewers out there. They've been giving all kinds of different advice, and some of them are just kind of more motorsport journalists, some of them are games journalists, and I want to dispel some of the bits and pieces that they've said in addition to that. So firstly, let's talk about how the game itself feels. It's a lot of fun. Would I say that it's realistic? Well, on tarmac it still has a bit of the kind of disconnect that you usually feel in rallying games. So for example, if we talk about Dirt as a game, the way that it works in terms of surfaces is everything is essentially gravel, they just have different friction coefficients. So that's how you get tarmac, and that's how the tarmac feels a bit gravelly. Here you still feel the suspension is a bit soft, so you can still feel a bit of roll. In fact, I managed to roll in the JWRC in my career mode just by clipping a curb wrong, which was very untoward. But at the end of the day, for me, the WRC game isn't necessarily about realism. I know that's one of the things they market it as, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit, but it's just a lot of fun for me, and it's all consistent. That's one of the things, like, you can feel when the car is at its limits, and in particular, one of the things that I felt through the wheel was that there's a difference between how the forces are when the car is on the throttle and off the throttle, and it differs as well between front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, and all-wheel drive, or four-wheel drive. And that is one of the things that's quite important, because at the end of the day, you want to be able to know what's different between all of these different parts of the game. Now, in terms of content, we've got an anniversary mode, which for me isn't actually working properly. For some reason, I can only access several scenarios in the actual anniversary mode. Doesn't matter how many times I pass the actual scenarios, I can't advance any further. And while some of them are quite fun, there's one in particular that's Sweden 2011, which is when Chris Patterson had to drive in place of Peter Solberg. It's the fact that I can't access them, and if I access them in career mode and complete them in career mode, they don't unlock. It's a bit odd. I'm hoping that that's going to get fixed. And in terms of content overall, I saw somebody saying they've got about 120 new stages, which it isn't. I think there are about 120 stages in the game in total, and the vast majority of them are reused, and a lot of elements are as well. So, in terms of stages like, say, New Zealand and Spain in the legendary part of it, the 50th anniversary mode, they are parts that were in the old build, so they were in WRC 9 or WRC 8. As regular stages, and it annoys me a bit to see that, well, they're like, okay, these are new. They're not. And the New Zealand one, we've only got half of what was in WRC 9 in terms of stages, but it's used 3 times. That said, some of the things that they've done to make it more inventive, so for example in San Remo, when you're looking at all of the different bits and pieces and what years they've got, there are different ways in which the spectators have organised themselves. So in the earliest ones, the spectators will stand right next to the road, which adds an extra little bit of danger to it, and I think that's pretty cool. That's a nice little extra touch. Another one that I noticed was if you're doing the Michelle Mouton scenario, it changes your co-driver regardless. If you've got the female co-driver, it changes the female co-driver to mimic having Fabrizia Pons, which I think is pretty cool as well. But yeah, I'm getting a bit distracted talking about that because there are all other kinds of different bits and pieces to talk about with this game. what else can I really say? The AI is still, well, surprisingly taking a step back compared to what's in the previous title. And when I say that, I mean, when I was on 100 difficulty AI in WRC 9, I had to dial it back because they were just too competitive for me around stages like Monte Carlo. In this one, I had it at 100, and I was winning stages by 20-30 seconds in the JWRC, which just isn't on. It's like, how am I able to do that kind of thing? I've heard from other kind of reviewers, streamers, players that they can turn up to 150 and still comfortably win a rally. I mean, I know it's a kind of just for fun thing, but at the same time, it defeats some of the goals. In other cases, like the extreme challenge mode, it is very hard to get the best out of it. Like, you have to do it once or twice to get close to getting to the end. Usually you use all 5 attempts to make sure you finish the run, which I think is really cool. I think that's a really good thing. And yeah, I just enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. And I think that's the main point that I keep coming back to. Because if you look at the livery editor, it's very simplistic. I would rather have it so it's like in games like ACC, Assetto Corsa Competizione, or the Assetto Corsa game itself, where you can have a template and just paint over it, because that would be so much easier, and it would mean that I'd be able to do what I wanted to do. And for some reason, the livery editor has the bonnet separate to the rest of the car. I don't understand that, but it is quite easy to create something that you quite like in terms of liveries, but you can't do it on a wheel. You have to do it either on a gamepad or on a mouse and keyboard, which is what I ended up doing. Same for photo mode. Can't really navigate it with a wheel and pedals. And in addition to that, there are some other issues that I have. In particular, yeah, the constant kind of reuse of content. That's alright. But and when I'm looking at what rallies are likely to be added, I looked through the game files and I saw, well, we've got IPA, which will be all new. And for some reason, like, Germany itself is there, separate to Panzerplatte, and Mexico is there. So if we're adding them in, I'm hoping it's not just going to be re-adding in the stages that were in WRC 9 or WRC 8. That to be able to mark them as new stages, at least they're going to be added as kind of free DLC, but it would be a bit unfair to say, yeah, this is brand new, when it wouldn't be. But I'm going to have to say that there are a couple of other issues. One was that the game suddenly crashed on me on a couple of occasions, especially when loading into stages. It doesn't help that the loading kind of music makes it sound like the game is crashing when it's around 10%, because that's when it usually crashes. But it's just the way that music plays. And there are parts of, say, the San Remo replay that I must have shown at some point of the Colin Craig run, where it just, the frame rates are almost unviewable, and given the specs that I have, I can run a lot of sim racing games on ultra settings, but I can't with this one. I'm running it on high instead of ultra, and I'm getting these kinds of frame drops, and sometimes even on board in the middle of a stage I'll be going down to 30 or 40 frames per second, which isn't ideal. I've heard criticisms of the sound. I don't have particularly many. I know it's a bit simplistic, but I'm not expecting it to be this big grand thing, because at the end of the day I'm just using some cheap earphones that I bought off the internet for like £10. So I've spent more money on the game than I have on my earphones, so I'm not expecting it to like set the world on fire or anything. And the graphics, they look alright. In terms of realism, it doesn't go down the same route that Dirt does, but it still looks good. And I think that brings me back to my main point for this all. It's fun. It's enjoyable. And that's, for me, what the WRC games are. The best kind of analogy I have, and I've said it several times, is... I've said this during my streams, I've said this to other people personally. The WRC games shouldn't be marketed as something that's a simulator. They should be more arcadey and more fun. They should have simulation elements. But the thing is, it's at its best when it's not trying to focus itself on being the most ardent simulator. The damage model is more comprehensive than Dirt, but it doesn't have as hardcore effects. So it's like comparing the F1 games to driving around in an F1 car in a Assetto Corsa. Because in the F1 games, they're not the most they're not the best simulation. A lot of the stages are like handcrafted instead of like laser scanned, and in the WRC games compared to Dirt, they're all just loosely based off of what the real world things are, but they're designed to be fun. They're not designed to be the most realistic renditions. And apart from the super specials, which are pretty realistic and they're a lot of fun to do, that's perfectly fine for me. But where it goes, okay, you could do realistic length rallies, that's not something that I think is particularly good for it. I know that there are ways to opt out of it, so I wouldn't mark it down for it. Some people would really enjoy it, but I think when you've only got 4, 5, 6 stages, and half of them are just the other half in reverse, it's not exactly ideal. It's the same thing that Dirt has, the same thing that all the other WRC games have had. So when somebody's criticising it for having that, I think that that's a really silly criticism to have, because it's something that rally games just have. RBR has had it. It's a staple of rallying gaming. You just double up the list by having the stages in reverse. It was something that was done originally to save space and make games more compact, but it's also just decent practice. And I don't understand that criticism of it, because that's the way these games have been. But what I would say is that if you've not got WRC 9, I would recommend it. If you are loving it because it's a WRC game, go for it. If you haven't had a WRC game before, I would genuinely recommend it. It's a lot of fun, and it's cheaper than a lot of other AAA titles you'll have out there, or a lot of motorsport licensed titles. It's cheaper than, say, the F1 game. And I'm going to get more time out of it. I'm going to get more enjoyment out of it than, say, the F1 game. And I do F1 League Racing. I commentate on it. And I record in the F1 game week in, week out. But for me, the WRC game, it's a lot of fun. WRC 10 is incredibly enjoyable. I'm not just saying that because I hold a bunch of world records, because I held world records in F1 2021 and Rally. And what I'll say is, for me, it's a lot like a game called V-Rally 3. V-Rally 3 came out nearly 20 years ago now. But what it had was a lot of brilliant points where it was very arcadey. The AI wasn't too hard to beat, but there was always the point where if you pushed too hard, the car was written off, and that would be your season seriously implicated, because you'd only have 5 or 6 rounds. And the AI would probably win that round and come second in all the other 5, so you'd have to hope that they had some kind of issue to win the championship. And that's where I've always seen the WRC games. And there are all these little faults, and I feel like I'll be nitpicking where I go, okay, so it says that Lowe's won San Remo 4 times, but he only competed there 4 times and only a couple of times won it. Or the Spain text being directly lifted off of the previous titles where Spain was, and it says, oh, it's a mixed gravel and tarmac event where it is full tarmac now. Those bits of things get quickly patched or quickly edited. Those are things where I feel like you're just nitpicking. The general game, it's enjoyable. There are bugs. I hope they get fixed. I'm glad that all the new content is being added for free, and they're bringing in replacement rallies for the season, like, say, Belgium and, well, the Acropolis, but that was already going to be in there through the Legacy mode. I'd love to see them add the Arctic Rally as well, just because then it gives a point to Codemasters saying you should bring in things like Istanbul and any other replacement tracks that F1 visits. Because I think that the fans deserve that, especially in the official game. But overall, I'll say basically the same thing that I said for WRC 9. It's a step forward. I'd recommend it if you haven't got the other title already, unless it's something where you're like, I want to have the newest stuff. If you're looking for something nostalgic, get it. If you're looking for a WRC game and you haven't played WRC games for 4 or 5 years, get it. There are only a couple of places where I feel like the game's made a step backwards, and even then, those are just some small quality of life bits and pieces. I love it. I really do. And I'm going to be having a lot of fun playing it on the stream or in just by myself for this next year. It's incredibly enjoyable. And on that note, I'm just going to say this. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for joining. And I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye for now.